Ah, okay. Okay. That's different. Oh, no. We have everybody online. Yeah. So. Okay. Well, welcome very much to this Latin American Summit panel on sustainable economic growth in Latin America. So we have three super interesting economists on the panel today that have varied experience interacting both in academia. They're all widely cited, distinguished academicians in economics, but they've also all dabbled to a greater or lesser degree in the policy world, in the private sector. They're all intersecting with many dimensions of economic growth, sustainability, and social welfare in Latin America. So I'm very hopeful that we'll have an interesting panel discussion today that intersects both with academic concepts and theories of economic growth, sustainability, and development, but also diverges and intersects a lot with the real world and the policy agenda and some of the more real life things that are so important when we're thinking about policies that actually achieve the outcomes that we want. So I'm going to first introduce our live panelists, and then we have two online panelists. I've got Francisco Pereira he is the Marta Sen Professor of Inequality Studies at LSE here. And before we bagged him here at the LSE, he had a long and distinguished career at the World Bank, widely published on economics, inequality in Latin America, and has taught also at various universities around the world, including in Rio de Janeiro and at the Paris School of Economics. So online, we have Luis Fernando Mejia, and I guess I'm not looking at him there. There we go. Luis Fernando is the executive director of Fede Desarrollo, which is one of the largest and most influential think tanks on Latin American economics. He was the deputy director of planning in Colombia and was responsible for overseeing the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Also director of macroeconomic policy in the Colombian Ministry of Finance, and has also taught economics at various universities, including the University of Chicago. And then third, we have Mercedes de Alessandro. Hello. Mercedes has a PhD in economics from the University of Buenos Aires, but has a very interesting career. She's an expert in feminist economics, and she was the first ever national director of economy, equality, and gender in the Argentinian Ministry of Economics. And she has written a very interesting book that I'm keen to go look up as soon as I leave this panel, with the title Economía Feminista, cómo construir una sociedad igualitaria sin perder el glamour. Economic feminism, how to create an egalitarian society without losing the glamour. So I think without further ado, then I will hand over the discussion to the three panelists. We have envisioned that each one will speak for 10 or 15 minutes on the general theme of the evening, which is how can Latin America achieve economic growth, balancing the needs of increasing welfare across society with environmental sustainability and social and gender equality. So after each speaker talks to this theme, we will come back and have a general discussion and then open it up to questions from the audience. So let's see, I think we have order here. Yeah, so I guess so on the schedule, we have first Luis Fernando Mejia. Luis?
Okay, thank you very much, Diana. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to share this panel with Francisco Mercedes as well. So I'm going to share a presentation. Hopefully, I'm going to be giving this presentation in the 10 to 15 minutes that you have allowed us to do so. So, okay, so I would like first to motivate a little bit the discussion, showing kind of a long-term perspective on the good news, especially on the economic front, then going over the challenges and talk a little bit about what I feel are the key issues that Latin America is going to have to tackle for the next decade or so to obtain this objective about prosperity and sustainable growth in the region. So let me start with the long-term perspective, and this graph that you have here, and I'm taking all this graph from a wonderful site that I invite you all to see, which is gapminder.org, which shows the incidence of extreme poverty in the world in 1823. So we're talking about 2 centuries ago. And you have here the extreme line poverty, which essentially is around $2.50 per day. And the figure here says that 2 centuries ago, about 78% of the population was living below the extreme poverty line. And you have areas here which are the regions of the world. So the red area means the Asian population. You have the blue area, which is the African population. You have the small green area, which is the American population, and the yellow area, which is Europe. And I'm gonna show you this graph at least 2 more times. So a lot of people were living in extreme poverty. The numbers are about 0.8 billion out of 1.1 billion that were living 2 centuries ago. So what happened 100 years after that? We're going to go to 1923. So of course you have more population. You start to see a little bit of the impact of economic growth. The numbers are now 56% of the population living on extreme poverty. That amounts to about 1.1 billion out of 2 billion people. And you see that especially Europe and the northern part of America managed to move out of extreme poverty in a great deal. And let's go now to the most recent numbers, and these are post-COVID numbers, 2021. And of course, the size of the mountains are much larger because we have many, many more population here. So we have almost 8 billion people in the world. And this is one of the key, I think, successes of economic growth for the past century is regardless of the fact that we have many, many more people now, the incidence of extreme poverty is much lower. So about 7.4% of the population were living in extreme poverty. That amounts to about 0.6 billion out of 7 billion people. And especially the incidence is in Asia and parts of Africa, and of course, a little bit of Latin America. Most of the North American population is on the right side of the extreme poverty line. So those are the good news. I mean, we have to recognize in the past, especially the past 100 years, that we have managed to grow at a very rapid pace. This is due to better provision of public goods like health, education. We have managed to increase longevity across the population, reduce child mortality, and incomes have risen due to all this very good news. Now, the bad news, and this is one of the key topics of what we're discussing today, is that with the latest numbers, unfortunately, this graph is a little bit outdated, but things probably haven't changed much for the past 5 years, is that richer economies tend to contaminate more. And this is not only about absolute terms, this is about per capita terms. So you have here on the horizontal axis, you have income per capita, income per person, and this is PPP adjusted. So each point is a country and the size of of the bubble, it tells you the size of the population. So you have here China, you have India. I'm also marking Colombia with the flag here, which is a middle income economy. And you have the green bubbles are Latin America and North America as well. So, and on the vertical axis, you have CO2 emissions per capita. And you do see that there's a strong relationship between the income of a country, average income, and the emissions per capita that these persons are doing. So I think this is one of the key challenges, of course, that we have tried to tackle for the past 10 years or so, is how to decouple economic growth from this phenomenon where, as you get richer, you tend to contaminate more per capita. That's where, of course, the SDG agenda comes into play. And as many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goals that were signed a couple of years ago, and where there's a lot of political agreement in terms of moving forward with this agenda. I think this agenda has three main goals: ending poverty, which is actually goal number 1 in this SDG agenda, protecting the planet. There are many goals here that aim specifically to protecting the planet. And you have here, for example, goal number 7, which is about affordable and clean energy. You also have goal number 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. You also have goals number 13, 14, and 15, which talk about climate action, life on underwater, life on land. So there's a broad, all-encompassing agenda that's not only thinking about social and economic issues, but also about environmental issues, and also, of course, ensuring peace and prosperity for all. So that's kind of the main way that humanity is tackling these challenges about reducing poverty, but also doing it in a way in which we can protect the planet. So let me give you a specific example of how we in Colombia start to think about the way to apply this SDG agenda with the particularities, of course, that each of the countries have. And this is SDG 1. I'm just going to show you one example, which is goal number 1, which is no poverty. Of course, thinking about eliminating poverty in lower or middle income economies by 2030 probably is too ambitious. So we started to set an ambitious goal, but not thinking that we're going to be able to reduce poverty in just well, we have 7 years left. So we set this goal, and we tackle this goal by reducing multidimensional poverty. So this measure goes beyond income measures and focus instead on access to health, access to education, access to housing, formal employment, and also child well-being. So it's more a structural measure of poverty going beyond income measures. And the baseline when we approved this target was 20.2% of the population were in multidimensional poverty. The target was reducing this to 8.4% of the population by 2030. And I have here what we're doing in terms of the intermediate targets. In 2021, we were at 16% of the population. So we're on track by reducing multidimensional poverty as fast as we expected. So that's good news. And we also had regional targets. It's not only about reducing multidimensional poverty in the country as a whole, but also reducing specifically in those regions of the country that have the higher incidence of multidimensional poverty, thereby closing regional gaps. Now, I'm going to go now to the ideas that, of course, how to implement this, how to reduce poverty, how to do it in a sustainable way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Latin American perspective. So the first question is how to tackle poverty in Latin American countries. And I think one of the key issues here is about removing barriers for productivity and output growth. And you see that there's a lot of the economic literature that have said that economic growth is key, and that's probably the main determinant for reducing poverty in economic policy. So in a recent book that we wrote in Desarrollo, we identified several barriers that impede growth in Colombia, and many of the things that we identified are actually pervasive around Latin America. And the top five barriers that we identified were low quality of institutions, and this is related specifically to the enforcement of contracts and the prevalence of corruption, There's a lot of disenchantment with democracy, and part of that is related to the corruption and the way that this affects the efficient provision of public goods for the Latin American population. Second was the absence of competition in key markets, which derives to a large extent from low exposure to international trade. And you do see that Latin America is a relatively closed region when you measure, for example, the size of exports or imports relative to gross domestic product. Third issue that we identified was labor informality that extends to about 60% of the labor force. That's in Colombia. Many other countries in Latin America have figures which are upwards on the 50% range. There are exemptions to these. For example, Chile has an informality rate which is close to 20–25%. But in general, in Latin America, we do have large labor informality, which explains low productivity growth. We also have low levels and low growth of public investment in infrastructure and low investment in innovation and research and development. And those were the 5 top barriers that we identified for growth in Colombia. And as I said, these issues are also pervasive in most of the Latin American countries. Now, one of the things is going to the diagnostic, but of course, we also have to think about ideas of how to improve social outcomes in a sustainable way. And I'm going to go in a couple of slides about some of the ideas that we have been moving forwards in Colombia. But again, I think those ideas also could apply to many Latin American countries. So first is, we have to increase the exposure to trade while at the same time diversifying exportable goods. That the region is mainly focused on basic commodities, but we do have to focus on how to reduce non-trade barriers, how to design productive development policies that solve market or governmental failures that prevent domestic firms from participating in global value chains. There's a lot of talk right now about friendshoring, nearshoring, and the region, of course, has the potentiality of take advantage of this type of new, trade agreements, if you wish. And the exposure to trade will be key for increasing output growth and employment growth as well. We also have to start building consensus for the discussion of fiscal reforms that increase tax bases. When you take a look at fiscal policy in many Latin American countries, we have a lot of personal income or sectoral exemptions, deductions, preferential treatments, which of course reduce the tax base and imply that tax income receipts are low, and that also has an impact on the quality of the provision of public goods. So we have to combat evasion, we have to improve tax administration, and maybe strengthening social safety nets through increased coverage could be a way to build this consensus for higher tax bases across the region. So in the sustainability issue, I think green taxes are a especially good idea because they provide the right signals from a public policy perspective so that private agents can internalize the costs that their behavior imposes on society and the environment. And also in the region, this type of green taxes have high legitimacy, which is not the case in some other developed economies like the US or even Europe. So that's an important opportunity to deepening, this type of instruments, aligning public and social interests, and again, probably increasing tax receipts. Tax reforms will not only stabilize public finances, but will also permit high public infrastructure investment, which might be quite necessary for the short term as a countercyclical tool. That the region probably will have low economic growth in this year and probably in next year as well. And also for the long term, because the economic literature has identified that public infrastructure investment is key for raising productivity. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the key issues that the region has been discussing for the past few years, and this is in part affected by the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis show in a very clear way that the Latin American region has to revise and adjust social contracts because exclusions continue to be pervasive in Latin America. And these exclusions greatly limit opportunities for social mobility, for economic growth as well. And I would like to mention three aspects that I think merit special attention for adjusting the social contrast. One is the access to formal labor markets. The second is the access to pensions, that is protection in old age, which are in reality two sides of the same coin. And finally, access to high quality of education. And these three aspects have a very important effect on the social contract, on inclusion and economic growth as well. So first, in Latin America, we have segmented dual labor markets. So we have formal and informal jobs, and these are not probably related. They are dual labor markets. We have a high incidence of informality, as I mentioned before, about 60% on average in the region. And the problem with that is that informal workers bear the whole risk of unemployment, the risk of no income after retirement because they do not contribute to pensions. And you know, an idea that could work is that worked in Colombia in 2012 is about reducing non-wage labor costs. And that idea was particularly useful for reducing informality in Colombia. And there has been some evaluations about how this actually managed to increase formality for the past few years. The second point is about, you know, again, these are two sides of the same coin. High informality implies low coverage in the pension system because people do not contribute to pensions if they are informal. And parametric reforms are necessary but not sufficient. While we resolve this informality problem, which is huge in the region, I think it is necessary to increase the coverage of non-contributory schemes. And in Colombia, for example, we have that just a quarter of adults, 25% of those people over 65 have access to pension, and those that are getting pensions are essentially people that are highly educated formal workers. So I think non-contributory schemes are highly progressive and could eliminate the risk of poverty or extreme poverty depending on the size of the transfer. Of course, it has to be adjusted to the fiscal possibilities of each country. And finally, I think education is key for social mobility, and education has been a key issue for the region. We have managed to increase coverage of basic middle income people in education, but still the quality of education has been a problem. And to mention this, I'm comparing here the years of schooling, which again have increased throughout the region, but there are important gaps. On average, the bottom quintile in the region gets 5 years less of education relative to the top quintile. And of course, this is an important barrier for social mobility. But also, if you look at quality adjusted years are much lower than observed education years. For example, in Colombia, and this again goes to many countries of the region, even though we have an average of 8.3 years of education compared to Japan's 12.8 years, so we have 4 years less, quality adjusted numbers are much lower. So in Colombia, quality adjusted years are 6.1, whereas in Japan, they are 12.4. So they're close in Japan. In Colombia, quality adjusted years are much lower. So we have half the years of education relative to Asian countries like Japan. So increasing the access to and quality of education is key for social mobility and economic growth. And the last message I want to give in this brief introduction is that we economists tend not to think hard about how to construct consensus for this type of social and economic reforms. And I think that's key. Most of the failure of social and economic reforms come not from a bad diagnostic or from a bad policy. It's about not being able to build consensus, and also about not thinking clearly about the appropriate sequencing of reforms. Maybe some reforms are more important in the short term, and once these reforms are approved, these reforms could unlock many other possibilities for new reforms in the medium term. So thinking about consensus buildings and the appropriate sequences for such reforms, I think it's key. So those are the messages I want to give an introduction. Thank you very much, Diana.
Okay, thank you so much. That was an excellent way to kick off the discussion. So next we have Francisco Pereira.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me okay. If the colleagues online can't hear, let us know. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and particularly thanks for the invitation to speak about something that isn't inequalities. That's what I talk about all the time. So I'm going to talk about growth today. Inequality will come in a little bit, but it won't be the center of the story. And you'll hear, I don't have a presentation, unfortunately, but you'll hear many common themes with what Luis Fernando just talked about. So, if you start from sort of economics 101 of growth and per capita income can be driven either by technological progress or by an increase in the amount of capital available per person. So it's typically either changes in technology and innovation or investment. And one reason why Latin America's growth has been lackluster, and it has really been lackluster. So just as a basic fact, many of you will know this, but if you look at the long-term growth over the last century, or at least from the middle of last century on, Latin America was converging with the advanced economies up until around about 1980. And since 1980, up until today, with blips, Latin America has not been converging. It has either been diverging, so growing more slowly than the United States, Europe, and advanced Asia, or staying parallel. Whereas Asia, as you probably could see from Luis Fernando's graphs, Asia has moved much faster, and we've been overtaken by Asia to a very large extent. So make no mistake, whatever you hear about growth in Latin America in one year or the other, it has been low, lackluster, disappointing. Latin America has a growth problem, very serious growth problem. And part of that comes from investment. I gave you there's two reasons: technological change and investment. For the economies on the technological frontier, technological innovation is the most important of those factors. For economies below the technological frontier, like most of those in Latin America, there's a role for innovation, but primarily this is catch-up growth. This is why growth in developing countries can be a lot faster than the 2 or 3% that we usually see in rich economies on average, right? So it's investment. A lot of it, in my mind, has to do with investment. And before I came down, I looked up at the investment numbers, and on average, Latin America has been in the last few years investing around 20% of GDP, which is not terrible, but it's below the United States, and it's considerably below Asia. And some countries like Argentina is investing 17% of GDP, Brazil 19%, Bolivia 17%, and so on. You've got some higher numbers in the Caribbean, but for most of the region, it's quite low investment rates. So one question behind growth in Latin America and why growth in Latin America is low is why do we invest so little? Why do we invest so much less than Asia, for example? There are, all kinds of explanations for this. Many papers have been written to do with interest rates, to do with different propensities to save, all kinds of things. I'm going to focus on one aspect, which is public investment. Public investment matters for overall investment in two ways. One, it's part of it. Total investment is public plus private investment. So if the government invests little, that's just arithmetically going to be lower investment rates. But in addition, public investment can crowd in private investment. So just think, for example, of better infrastructure, better roads, better electricity provision means that companies who have a reliable electricity supply or face a low cost of moving their goods to the port and therefore being more competitive. In the absence of this kind of public investment, you've got less educated labor, you've got less reliable energy, less reliable ICT, higher transport costs, companies invest less. Latin America has very low rates of public investment as well. And our public investment is not only low, but it's typically costly and inefficient as well. Now, why is that? Why is and this, by the way, also has to do with human capital. So Luis Fernando talked a little bit about education and the quality of education. Indeed, Latin America tends to underperform in the PISA score, in the PISA test scores, and a number of other measures of the both quantity and quality of education. And he gave us some numbers before. And that also has to do with public investment in human capital. So I am putting public investment at the center of our failed and disappointing growth experience of the last 40 years or so. And behind that are two sets of reasons about the state, about the nature of the Latin American state. In some cases, it invests little because it's small. It taxes too little. But that, it used to be the sort of standard description of Latin America, is less true today. So looking up again a very recent paper by Nora Lustig and collaborators that has government revenues as a percentage of GDP here. And you've got 5 countries that have a government revenue to GDP ratio of 30% or more. Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Uruguay, with Venezuela close behind. Now, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and Ecuador raise more as a share of GDP than the United States, and yet provide quality of services that, even adjusting for the level of GDP, is much lower. So I think the sort of public investment tragedy of Latin America arises from two sources. The traditional one, which is still true for most of the continent, is just low taxation and low government spending, a small state. And this is true, if you look here, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Mexico, Paraguay, and Honduras, and Panama are just below 20%. And Colombia is the next one, just around 20% of GDP in government revenue. So when Luis Fernando talked about small states and states that need to expand the tax base and the tax stake, that is certainly true of Colombia and of these other countries I just mentioned, but it is not necessarily true of Argentina and Brazil, which are taxing a greater proportion of GDP than the United States. There, it really has to do with efficiency. So, but now, so, I started from investment. Why is that? Public investment is low. Why? The nature of the state. Why is the state the way it is? And I think there it reflects sort of 2 different versions of a social contract in Latin America. And again, Luis Fernando mentioned social contract. I think the classic view, the classic vision we have of social contract in Latin America is the one for the small state. But why do these countries, let's forget the high and inefficient taxes like Brazil and Argentina. Think for a moment of Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala. These countries tax too little. Why is that? We can go on at great length, but a very stylized and sort of approximate version of the story is these countries have small, very powerful and rich elites who have a lot of political power and set the tax rates. And they basically decided, look, we're going to opt out of public services. We're going to send our kids to private school. We're going to have private health insurance, private hospitals. We're even going to have public security. So we don't trust police that much. Everything we're going to be private. In the Dominican Republic, even for energy generation, they have massive amounts of electrical generators at home. So this should resonate with some of you who are Latin Americans. That's a common story. So if the elite and the upper middle class, by the elite, by the way, I'm including almost everyone you would normally call middle class, because in Latin America, we have this idea that we're all middle class. If you're from Latin America and you are here, almost certainly you are in the top 5% of the distribution in your country, if not higher. So this is the elite. We are the elite in Latin America, and it goes a little bit beyond that. So, we opt out from public services and we set low tax rates because we don't care, right? So, provide this other stuff to these people as you like, but we have got our private. That clearly can't be what's happening in Brazil and Argentina and and to some extent Ecuador and Bolivia, as I just mentioned. So there's something else going on, and I think it's newer and we understand it less well. I'm going to venture that some of it is another kind of capture, but it's not a capture so much by the traditional Latin American elites. It's also a capture by a kind of more real middle class that benefits directly from the state. Pensioners, public servants, people who study in subsidized universities, all of whom are not poor, but benefit from a state that spends a lot on pensions, who has public servants that are, in many cases, not the people who do the real work of cleaning the streets or teaching, but the bureaucrats are typically overpaid. And where, the rich send their kids to private school, so they learn enough to then go to private universities, to public universities, where they benefit from public investment in university, which is highly regressive. So you get a free university education because you went to a private school, and no poor person goes there up until recently. Now there are quotas and all kinds of affirmative action things, but up until recently, that was the story. So you've got these different social contracts, and you see that I couldn't escape from inequality in the end, because there is this issue of the capture of the state, and this is deeply rooted in sort of long-standing state failures that reflect a history of inequality in Latin America. I just came back yesterday from Colombia, actually, where I was at a conference in Cartagena on inequality in Latin America, very big conference, and a lot of talk about the importance of understanding our historical legacy, going back to slavery in places like Brazil and Haiti, but also the exploitation of indigenous populations in the Andean countries and so on. And it's no coincidence that Argentina and Uruguay are the least unequal countries in the region, because they had less of both of these things. And Chile is actually very unequal, but that's a different story. Okay, what to do about it? I don't know how much time I have, but very quickly, one will go on at length. Luis Fernando already mentioned various things. Let me just talk about things in two levels: the policy level and the deeper level. Well, at the policy level, that is to say, without questioning and challenging the social contracts that I've described, there are certainly technical policy recommendations we can make. One of them, two of them follow directly from what I said about low public investment. So we should focus on enhancing the quality of the education we provide, particularly to younger children, with early childhood development, and including primary and secondary school in that order of importance. And there, Latin America has made a lot of progress, but incomplete progress on quantity of schooling. If you see the expansion of years of schooling, Latin America does quite well compared to other places over the last 40 to 50 years. The quantity of schooling has improved. The quality of schooling has improved much less. And without summarizing a very large literature, we now are pretty confident in development economics that the quality of education is not really driven by building schools or giving people laptops. Those things can help. But what really matters is teachers, good teachers, teachers that have the right pedagogical methods. This is not easy to do, because it's not buying a whole bunch of laptops and delivering them. It's about training teachers the right way. But that's what works. Okay. So quality of education, infrastructure. Look, let me tell you that when I was a kid, I didn't go to China when I was a kid, but I saw pictures of roads in China, and they were much worse than Brazilian roads. But then when I was an adult, I went to China, and they were much better than the Brazilian road by far. I mean, the roads in China, not every road in China, but the big roads in China, are massively better. As a result of which, transporting things in China is much cheaper than it is in Brazil. We talk about custo Brazil in Brazil. So we have this bad infrastructure that acts as a drag in the economy in Latin America in many places. Possible exception of Chile in some areas. And then we need pre-distribution and redistribution. By pre-distribution, I mean, again, investment in education, but also in early childhood development. And redistribution is some transfers in a system of social assistance that helps fight some of that inequality that lies behind the divisive social contract. So that's at the policy level. But there is a deeper level. Right? You might say if inequality is so important and exclusion is so important in this fractured society with this kind of social contract where the rich depart from the poor and so on. If that's the problem, surely we are on the way to fixing it now, right? We've got a left-wing government in Brazil. We've got a left-wing government in Argentina. We've got a left-wing government in Mexico. We've got a left-wing government in Colombia. We've got a left-wing government in Chile. We had a left-wing government in Peru. It's unclear what's going to happen. You know, it's basically, you know, one or two countries where we don't have Bolivia. You know, so these people are going to fight the inequality and are going to redistribute, and we're all going to be good. Well, Argentina has been having left-wing, you know, Peronista government on and off for a very long time, and things have not gotten better, right? In Brazil, under Lula, I think things did get better for a while. You know, we're very happy that we don't have Bolsonaro anymore. But I think there's something else going on, and I think that's the Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, that these four countries are the ones that are taxing above 30% of GDP, is not a coincidence. And here, you know, I think there's been real progress in redistribution and spending in all of these countries. Don't get me wrong. Some of what these countries are investing on makes sense, but not all. And I think there's a challenge. I'm going to try and be provocative here now. There's a challenge in that these left-wing governments often respond to a constituency of unions, teachers' unions, public servants, pensioners, who back them, who think of themselves as not rich, but who are certainly not poor, and who capture a disproportionate share of wealth. So we've got an entitled upper middle class who, through sending their kids to free public universities, through getting massively subsidized pensions, and through getting, you know, through extracting substantial public sector wage increases, they're not the bankers, yeah, that we tend to sort of say, okay, that's the 1%. But these guys are getting a big share of these taxation above 30% of GDP. They should get less of it, and more of it should go to early childhood programs and education, to the real poor, who often are less vocal in protesting in the streets, okay, than these middle classes are. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Super. So let's move on to Mercedes, and then we'll come back together for a general discussion. Mercedes.
Okay, hi, how are you? I will speak in Spanish, if you don't mind. You have a translation, so I will start. First, bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. I was listening to Francisco Fernando very attentively, and I think that in some areas we can discuss, and in some other areas we are aligned with our ideas. I would first like to focus on the situation that Latin America was left at after the pandemic. We all are aware of that, but just to tell you what my diagnosis is, right? We had three crises that were combined. One was a healthcare crisis, the other one was economic crisis, and a care crisis. We add from a feminist economy perspective that has to do with the asymmetrical distribution of the chores of work at home, which in the context of lockdowns resulted in a large abandonment of the labor force by women. And in Latin America, women went back 2 decades in their work and economic participation. And in most of Latin America, they haven't been able to go back to the pre-pandemic levels. This is not the case of Argentina. Perhaps we can discuss Argentina later, but healthcare crisis, economic crisis, and care crisis. we can say that the healthcare crisis was able to be overcome. We're thinking in terms of a post-pandemic nowadays with the caveats that we need to take into account for the future, but the economic and the care crises are still with us. And we can also talk about the climate crisis, since this is a topic that is in the title of the panel. For example, in Argentina today, we are experiencing a drought that is going to result in a loss of 25% of crops, with all the implications this has in terms of development, growth, reserves, and this is due to climate change. But in addition to this, in the visions that we have been discussing for Latin America, we see that this is going to be a year with not significant growth, as Francisco Fernando said, and we have inflation also. I'm not even going to tell you about Argentina. Tomorrow, the inflation index is going to be published, and it's going to be over 100% interannually. That is to say 5.8%. In some countries, that would be the annual inflation, but in Argentina, it's going to be the February inflation, and it's going to result in more than 100%. And so in this framework, poverty becomes worse. There's a food emergency as well. And in a significant part of Latin America, there are many countries with high debt. Argentina has the highest debt in the history of the IMF. And therefore, Argentina is constrained by an economic program that is based in the USA. So in this context, recession, debt, inflation, poverty, food security, climate crisis, the responses from the economy have to look a little bit further away. And why do I say this? Well, because in a fiscal path where we need to see if we pay debt, or if we import energy, or if we invest in infrastructure, or if we take care of the multiple demands of the population through social protection. Imagine that what the state can do in these contexts, even if we have progressive governments or left-wing administrations that have ideals or that have objectives that try to strengthen the role of workers, this area becomes very complicated when we have so many challenges and so many restrictions at the same time. And here we can see a debate that has emerged in the last years, at least in many countries in Latin America. The old theory of the spillover effect that said we have to grow to then be able to distribute, or how do we distribute in the framework of a not so significant growth? And the example that I can give you is, well, an Argentine example, but there are many international cases as well with the pandemic and with the post-pandemic time, which meant a rebound of the economy in some countries and a significant growth. The distribution of wealth hasn't followed the path of, okay, we grow and then we redistribute, and therefore lower income workers are better, right? No. The growth in most of our economies has come with very precarious conditions for work. The precarious nature and informal nature of employment or labor have increased. And so the growth that we were waiting for it to spill over downward is resulting in poor workers vis-a-vis the inflation levels of the different economies, with instability in their employment, in their jobs, particularly for women and for young people. And that's where I think there are many discussions to be held. It was mentioned just now that Latin America has had some important changes, political changes, with the arrival of Gabriel Boric in Chile, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, Ignacio Lula da Silva in Brazil, and well, in Bolivia as well, we have President Arce. In Argentina, we have a Peronist government that is a government that is related to progressive and left-wing ideas, and that in a way, well, in Mexico also we can talk about Mr. López Obrador. So all this makes up a possibility, and I say possibility because this is not a fact yet, a possibility to start thinking about how to strengthen a certain issues regarding a regional bloc. I think there are two topics that are very important to be discussed in Latin America. One is the distribution of wealth, and this opens the door to having a new fiscal pact. You must know that Ocampo, the Minister of Economy, Gustavo Petro, convened a fiscal summit in Colombia for the first days of May, which will continue in Chile and then in other places to discuss how to face an economic transition that has to have a gender perspective, an environmental perspective, that has to bridge inequality gaps in the framework of these very highly indebted countries. So how, with this narrow fiscal path between the debt and the pressure left from the pandemic regarding the erosion and the investment, Argentina used 7 points of the GDP for social protection and for what we call the COVID package. And so here we have the idea or the case of, okay, what kind of taxes we can propose, not only thinking about taxes for the wealthy or the tax to wealth or tax to unexpected income, which is a part of the discussion, but also thinking about taxes, not only as a way to gain or to obtain more funds, but also as a way to shape the way in which we want the economy to be. What does this mean? Well, how are we going to work with, for example, hydrocarbons, with lithium, with the copper? What taxes are going to be levied and what are those taxes are going to be tied to? For example, the tax to large wealth or significant wealth in Argentina. I don't know if you know that in 2021, at the beginning of the year, a special extraordinary tax was levied, a one-off tax, which was for people that had above a certain number of millions of pesos. It was very wealthy people. Only 12,000 people were subject to that tax, only 12,000 people, out of 10,000 of which paid the tax only. And so this tax was used to invest in the urbanization of informal settlements, that is the lowest income neighborhoods in Argentina. It paid for a Progresar program, which is education for youth. It was used to finance the purchase of vaccines, and it also was used to improve research in energy. It was also part of that project. So that tax that was levied for the first time in Argentina during the pandemic aimed at certain activities that otherwise would have had little financing and would have had to be perhaps relegated or would have had to be slower, let's say. So this is just an example of the fact that when we're thinking about new fiscal pacts, we need to see them as a new opportunity to shape the economies to be able to take them to the objectives that we want them to go to.
And the second point that I think is related to the name of this panel is that of natural resources. Latin America for a long time has been a space in which extraction by the US, Europe, and even China has been very strong. Exports pay very little taxes on minerals, lithium, oil. They are polluting as to their production. lithium is being discussed in Mexico too, and to be extracted from clay, you need a lot of water, and it's surrounded by populations with little access to water. So we have lithium and all its promises, but on the other hand, we have a resource like water, and we must discuss how we are going to go about it. So this that we need in Latin America, because Latin America needs US dollars, it needs to export to be able to think of moving forward, of growing. How are we going to manage so that this is not done at the expense of our inhabitants, our geography, our environment, our climate? So I think that there we have at least two areas of discussion: to have a fiscal pact to shape the economies. And we must also see what tools we have so that we don't face another extractivist era. And to round off this idea, I think that the role of the state is something that we must reinforce. The state is not a technocracy where I can say, well, we've got to invest a little more here, and that really happens, because that 1% that I take to another sector entails taking that away from another. So there are disputes, challenges. We could wonder why in Argentina don't we again tax the big wealth? Why? Because there are political pressures, power, concentrated groups, the media. There's a social debate that's still ongoing that is related to growth, distribution, merits. There are many debates that have not been completed as to our economic narratives either. So political representation is also important. And to be a little positive in wrapping up my presentation, I think there are two projects that have been strongly growing across Latin America. Firstly, feminism as a political project. Feminism is not only debating whether there's gender-based violence or not, if you've got to speak in an inclusive manner or not. Feminism is a way of redistributing wealth and revenue, improving women's share in the economy. This has a direct impact on all social indicators, because if women have less income, more or work longer hours, or have a higher level of unemployment, any policy to improve their working conditions and revenue will have an impact on the whole of society. And the great political project that's been particularly promoted by youth is that regarding climate change. There we face great challenges too, and we can't wait very much longer. Today, we are talking in an environment of students and researchers at universities, but the economic theories are not yet including with strong belief all these investments that are crucial, decisive. For instance, in Argentina, we are having a terrible drought that will have an impact on harvesting and reserves in our country, and that will impact the macroeconomy of our country. So how can we improve these forecasts for the forthcoming years as to what we expect from climate change, to be ready to anticipate any shocks that we may have and that do not appear in any economic model that is currently being analyzed. To wrap up, I'd like to say that the economy is related to policies and to politics. I am a part of the Ministry of Economy and had to implement policies to face the pandemic. And there we found that theory, Excel spreadsheets, and projections are essential tools, no doubt, but we cannot forget about the fact that there's our interests at stake, many power-related factors, and Latin American states are weaker somehow because all these left-wing governments have won by a very small margin, 0.5 for Lula, Boric, and Petro. We have very fragmented society where all the fatigue of the pandemic and the crisis experienced has had an impact on the expectations of people regarding the economy and their governments. And that, I believe, is something that must be borne in mind to think how we can move forward with an economy that really meets these needs, an economy that speaks to our hearts and that encourages us to do things better in a fairer and more equal societies where we can find a certain level of happiness, which is an economic factor that we must not leave aside when holding these discussions. So thank you very much. Yes, of course, I agree that economic growth is a core matter for governments. But what I wanted to point out is that in some cases, growth does not suffice because there's a distribution matrix that concentrates all that growth in certain elites or small groups. And that's something that's been happening, that growth has remained in the hands of food companies, pharmaceutical companies, energy companies. There we have a problem because it is not working as it should. I'm not that convinced, but that's why I thought it was an important point to discuss. But of course, I agree on the issue of opportunities that are most unequal in Latin America. Not everyone has the same possibility of going to school, particularly girls and women that are born in a faraway town, or sometimes those in remoter areas. I mean, there are more chances of having adolescent pregnancies, child marriage. They can't even dream of attending university or working for a salary. So having equal opportunities is a way to improve the different inequalities we face, of course, but for that we need investment. And here I go back to this point. From where a state obtains funding for investing in school, social protection, health, in pension regimes, in a dual employment market, as Fernando showed us, in economies with little fiscal space for investment, and where concentration of wealth is in just a few hands. And finally, there are studies that in Argentina show that spending on social protection has grown a lot. However, poverty has not been reduced at the same pace. I agree that transfer of money by itself is not a response in itself. Transfer of money may be a palliative factor, but education, infrastructure, training, teaching of crafts, those opportunities generated there are important, and we need money for that, but money is not going to those spaces for several reasons nowadays.
Moving along pretty well time-wise, so I think we can open. Well. Absolutely.
Sorry, since we did have a go, each of us, I do have a few things to say on this, but I'll be brief.
Yeah.
So on the growth and redistribution discussion, I mean, I think we all agree, all three of us, that growth is really important. What I do want to signal is that I don't think the two problems are separable. You can't, I do agree with Mercedes that you cannot have this trickle down belief that we first grow and then redistribute it. These two things are not independent. And although there is no sort of smoking gun causal evidence that inequality is bad for growth in the sense of experimental economics or something, because it's macro and it's hard to do, the preponderance of the evidence, the balance of the evidence is that in the long run, high inequality is bad for growth. High inequality is bad for growth for two reasons. One, because it leads to these elites that capture the state and implement policies that are good for them and not for everybody else. This is the Alesina and Roderick or Person and Tabellini argument of old. And it's also bad for growth because of the opportunities that Luis Fernando was talking about. If you don't educate half your population, you waste a lot of human talent. You waste a lot of human potential, and therefore you don't get all these people who could have been great engineers and doctors and whatever they might have been. And so for these two reasons, I think is what we find this association that that high inequality is bad for growth. So provided you don't redistribute in a very inefficient way, redistributing can be pro-growth. And I think that's what we have to try to do in Latin America. We have to try to combine the growth agenda with efficient redistribution. That's one thing. The other thing is I'm very much, I'm very interested in inequality of opportunities. It's an area I've worked on. I agree with both of the speakers that inequality of opportunities matters and is very high in Latin America. I do want to say again, there is not a dichotomy between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunities. Indeed, the two are highly correlated. Countries with low inequality of opportunities in the world tend to have lower inequality in incomes. Countries with high inequality of opportunities tend to have high inequality in income. This is analogous to the Great Gatsby curve on mobility and income. And this is the data. There's data out there to say that. And the kind of mechanism is obvious, right? Today's incomes, families' incomes, shape tomorrow's opportunities. So if you've got massive wealth and income inequality, you're going to have higher inequality of opportunity. So I agree that we should focus on inequality of opportunities, but this is going inevitably to entail that we have to redistribute income and wealth. And so long as we do that in a smart way, that could also be pro-growth. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we had three very super interesting presentations, and as we have moved along, they have become, I think, getting closer and closer to the theme of the evening, which is thinking about how policies can promote growth while also promoting social welfare and environmental sustainability and addressing inequalities, well, of opportunities and of gender, which is really the tricky nexus of the problem. It's one thing to think about policies for growth. It's quite another to try and incorporate sustainability and inequality in that mix. So I think I'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Hello, I just want to know the panelists' opinions on the recent regionalization of the world, like Western countries, Europe and North America, trying to kind of distance themselves from China, and how will this trend and the nearshoring, reshoring trends are going to affect Latin America, given that Latin America is both has ties with the US, very strong ties with the US, particularly Mexico and Central America, but also big receivers of big investments from China. So what are your opinions on this restructuring of the geopolitics and its effects on the economy of Latin America?
Okay, maybe you want to take questions and then answers, or you can do like question answer. Okay, I think that because otherwise we'll forget what the questions are. So, do any of the panelists would like to take a shot at responding to regionalization and the relationship with China versus the United States?
Well, I do have a comment on that. I recently wrote an article for America's Quarterly on specifically this topic about what to do relative to this competition for between the two superpowers, the U.S. and China, especially given the long-standing relationship that the region has had with the United States. And the basic issue that I tried to say in that article was that Latin America shouldn't take sides between the U.S. and China. What it should is take advantage of the opportunities that, of course, continue to be on the table, given what the U.S. has been doing in terms of trade agreements, in terms of the Build Better Back World initiative, which probably will have more investment for the region, but also taking advantage of China's interest in the region. I mentioned specifically that some countries in the region have actually joined the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. I think many other countries in the region should do so. because that's access to finance infrastructure that will be helpful for mitigation and adaptation for climate change as well. So not taking sides, taking advantage of opportunities that open up with both the US and China, I think it's the safe bet. You know, many countries have done so, specifically Peru, also Ecuador, and you know, being aware that the economic opportunities that will come from nearshoring will also be useful for dynamizing economic growth. So that's kind of the main message that I try to convey in my article.
Francisco, you said.
No, I think it's going to be bad for us and for most other people because, you know, it's this sort of deglobalization is a response to the fact that in the rich countries, when they had a lot of trade, they didn't protect the losers from trade. The losers from trade are really pissed off, and politicians, you know, Trump and all that. And so the politicians have moved not to protect the losers from trade, but to try to cut trade. And I don't think that's the right way to go. And we are going to suffer from it. And we're going to also, you know, I mean, everything Luis Fernando said is right. But you notice that what he said is all about responding to a situation that is given, because we as a region have very little power in these negotiations.
Yeah, my question is related to something that Mercedes was saying about the level of fragmentation that we have in societies in Latin America. I know it's at a regional level. I can speak more of Argentina, that now we have like 50-50% one side, and on the other side fighting against each other, and it's been like that for decades. So my question is, at a country level and at a regional level, what would be the way of starting to think towards a sustainable development while it's actually unifying societies and countries in the region as well?
Oh, excellent. Mercedes, did you want to?
Sí, yo la verdad que para mí es una preocupación. Bueno,
For me, this is a concern. Argentina, we call it the fracture. We can see this in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. It's something that is there, that is going throughout Latin America. Lula just took office with a Congress where he's not going to have a majority, and therefore he's going to try to promote and negotiate anything he wants to move forward. Boric, in its first term of its administration, which was yesterday, has lost significant support, has lost support by society. And so this is very difficult because the promises or the objectives that these administrations that are progressive and left-wing have are not easily, or they cannot be met, they cannot be complied with very easily. And therefore, this brings about certain frustration as well. And I also believe that radical changes towards very conservative left wings, which in the case of Argentina, the right wing is represented by a man who says that he's going to set fire to the central bank. So imagine, in that context, it's difficult to think about continuity or institutional continuity, and in political terms as well. And so there are challenges to be able to create certain consensus in certain items that are very strong. Argentina has to create consensus as to how they're going to relate to the IMF, for example. I also think that we need to think about social investment in social protection, in which are the strategic sectors that have to be promoted. Perhaps not so much, perhaps the house are not so easy, but at least we need to think about the what, right? The what's. And so I think that there are some issues that belong to a cross-cutting agenda. For example, feminism. Feminism has been used, or has been helpful to agree among different political forces for certain specific objectives. A non-economic example that has, of course, an economic leg is legal abortion in Argentina. Legal abortion in Argentina was pushed by people from all the political spectrum, except for the anti-rights, conservative, right wing. All the other political parties contributed or supported legal abortion. There were the others that were opposed to it, of course, but the ideology behind the political parties was not a breaking point. And so there are things that can be built. And then in this regard, there is a very significant challenge. And that's why I love these dialogue spaces, because you are learning in Europe, where the Eurozone also tries to build consensus. And so we need to think about these ideas and to think about what the factors or the pillars that we would have to agree on are, so that this political fragmentation can have some channel that will allow us to think about a short-term, medium-term, and long-term moving forward.
Yeah, my question is regarding how to cope with the tensions that you have mentioned between growth and inequalities, particularly in the long run. Like from your discussion, one of the things that I was thinking about was precisely how to fund the need to have like improved social expenditure, while at the same time not doing so in a responsible manner to have, for instance, 100% inflation rates. Like how to cope with this idea, for instance, in terms of climate change. The particular case of Colombia, it's clear about this and how we are going to need to reduce the biggest source of revenue that we have, that is oil, which is the source that it's actually financing the social expenditure in Colombia. So my question is like how to come together with these two ideas so that we can envision a way to move forward and actually both promote growth while at the same time reducing inequalities in a responsible and sustainable manner.
That's the big question.
So I can try to give a few observations on that. So there's a key debate here in Colombia about the speed of the energy transition. President Petro mentioned during the campaign that he will forbid any new exploration for oil and mining once he was in power. He hasn't done that because there's a lot of discussion specifically of the impact of that type of measures, not only from the exports point of view, but also from the revenues point of view. So oil and mining explain about 60% of the exports of Colombia. And, there's in good years, it could be almost a quarter of total fiscal revenue. So there's no easy way to phasing out the dependence of oil and mining from Colombia, from the Colombian perspective. And actually, Argentina has actually increased a lot its oil production using fracking, which in Colombia, it would be politically unviable, right? It's very interesting because even leftist governments have actually incentivized oil production. And you know that, for example, today in the US, there's a lot of discussion about this Alaskan pipeline from a democratic government. And in Colombia, there seems to be in a scenario, or at least a political scenario, which could actually forbid new oil explorations in the short term. I don't think that's the right way to do so. I think in the short term, it's unviable. It's not feasible to get away from the much needed oil and mining revenues. And actually, if you think about the energy transition, you won't have an energy transition without a mining boom. There's a lot of minerals that are needed for oil and for solar and wind energy production. So to me, the way to think about this would be, earmark some of these revenues that are coming from the oil and mining sector and spend them on the energy transition to compensate, of course, population, to actually increase investment in energy transitions, And I think, there's no easy way to do this. We have to think about it in the long term, but I don't see any other country, at least oil producing countries, that could actually think about abandoning oil and mining production in the short term. So a better way to do so would be earmark some of these revenues again to finance the energy transition. That's going to cost money, and probably the best source would be especially those fossil fuels which are actually polluting the environment, and doing so in a gradual way. We cannot do this in 3-4 years. We have to think about this in a 10-year, 15-year transition.
Francisco, would you like to?
No, I mean, just briefly, because it'd be interesting to hear me. I said this on, well, I mean, as I said, I don't think in absolute terms there is a trade-off necessarily. There can be taxes, of course, create disincentives and so on. But at the same time as taxes create disincentives, if you're investing on poor children and on people who didn't have opportunities before, you can get growth out of that, but not tomorrow, in the long run, right? So in the long run, I don't think there is a trade-off if the redistribution is well done. In the short run, I mean, two very general points. I think on those countries that are in the first political equilibrium that I mentioned, which is the low taxation ones, I'd rather be them, unfortunately, than Brazil, which is where I am, because they can raise taxes. Mexico, Colombia, a number of other countries do have probably quite a bit of space to increase taxation and spend it well in infrastructure and schools and whatever. It's harder for countries like Brazil and Argentina, where I think the sort of return to new taxes becomes problematic when you start taking, 40-something% of GDP, as I say. So then we're back to the political games that, as I was talking about, where the 1% here has to come from somewhere else. Maybe some of it can still come from taxes, but it's more complicated. And then lastly, on this environmental point, I mean, I haven't said anything about climate yet, but of course it is a massive challenge facing all of us. And there, the problem is, it's a tragedy of the commons, isn't it? It's very hard for a country to do something individually, because you just lose yourself. Gustavo Petro in Colombia has tried to do that, has tried to take, sort of go first in terms of closing explorations and moving Colombia away from oil and so on, because he really believes in these things. But then, people are free riding on him, basically. So you need to have the countries, come to international agreements. That's what we've all been watching. And this coordination failure is the world's biggest problem today, probably. And I don't have an answer to it.
Mercedes, would you like the last words on?
I have to go for another meeting right now. I'm sorry, but I have another meeting appointment right now. But muchas gracias por todo.
Thank you so much, and I hope we can continue building on ideas and scenarios that are inspiring into the future.
Reached the end of the hour, but thank you very much to all the panelists for a discussion about very important and very, very difficult questions facing Latin America. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Remember that we're having a lot of panels in the following days until Friday. So now you can just follow us on Instagram of the LSCSU Latin American Summit, and we expect to see you all in the following days. Thank you so much for coming. And you can have a cookie before going.
Cookie ready.
Exactly.